Okay, let's review the Constitution in relation to this chapter. When we look at the Constitution, you should have a copy of the Constitution in your textbook. What you want to do is notice the preamble to the Constitution. And then next you'll notice that Article 1 to the Constitution is related to the legislative branch. It states that the first part of the Constitution, Article 1, deals with the organization and the powers of the lawmaking branch of the national government, which is Congress. Section 1 of Article 1, it states all legislative powers therein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the U.S., which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. So, Article 1, Section 1 to the Constitution actually establishes the legislative branch, and that the two houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, will consist of the legislative branch, and all legislative power will be held there. Next, it talks about the House of Representatives in terms of composition and the election of members. Remember that the House of Representatives is based upon population. A census is taken every 10 years, and this year, 2020, is a census year. And that census helps to determine representation in the House. Now, is it possible as a result of the census for a state to lose or gain representation? Yes, it is. So don't be shocked if a state loses a representative, but they will not lose a senator. Remember, this only applies to the House. Every state will at least have one representative. Now, if we continue to look at this same article, it talks also about the Senate. And it states in Article 1, the Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Now, remember that originally the members of the Senate were selected by the legislative bodies within their state. So the state legislators were responsible for selecting the senators. This changed with the adoption of the 17th Amendment in 1913, which made it possible for us, the American voter, to actually vote directly for the senator, taking that out of the hands of the states and placing it into the hands of the people. It goes on to tell you in Clause 2 that 1/3 of the Senate seats are open to election every 2 years. So every 2 years, Congress comes up for election. In the House of Representatives, you have 435 members, and they all come up for re-election. In the Senate, only 1/3 of those will actually come up for re-election. And then it goes on to tell you that the vice president is considered the president of the Senate. But the vice president is usually never present. The only time that the vice president typically participates in Senate business is when the vice president is needed to actually break a tie. So in the place of the vice president, usually in the Senate, you have an individual referred to as the president pro temp. That individual is actually responsible for the day-to-day operations or conducting business in the Senate, which is heavily influenced by the majority and the minority leaders within the Senate. So let's go to actually Section 8 of Article 1. Section 8 of Article 1 is very important because it outlines the powers of Congress. It basically tells us these are the powers granted to Congress. These are the powers that we want Congress to have. If you look at Section 8, Clause 1, taxing. Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excise to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the U.S. Import taxes shall be uniform throughout the U.S. So, any goods that are imported into the U.S., the taxes, which we refer to as a tariff that's placed on those goods, is determined by Congress. We also know that the taxes that is collected from the citizens and the overall taxes collected is supposed to be used for defense and general welfare. So let's go on to clause number 2. it talks about, can Congress borrow money? It tells you, yes, Congress has the ability to borrow money. Number 3, the regulation of commerce. Congress is responsible for the regulation of commerce between states and then with other foreign countries in terms of the U.S. It talks about, Clause 4 talks about naturalization and bankruptcy laws. Well, we know naturalization deals with actually becoming a citizen, so we know that they're responsible for making sure that there is a process in place for that. And it talks about bankruptcy laws, that Congress actually make those laws as well. Clause 5 talks about money and standards, to coin money, to regulate the value thereof, and to fix the standard of weights and measurements. So, in other words, Congress has the ability to determine what type of money will be printed. They will determine the value of money. They determine the type of measurement system that we actually use. All of that is determined by Congress. Clause 6, counterfeiters. It talks about the fact that individuals that are caught counterfeiting money, the penalty may be imprisonment or up to 15 years plus fines. It also talks about roads and post offices. Post roads, including all routes over which mail is carried, highways, railways, waterways, airways. All of that, again, is the responsibility of Congress. Then we see Clause 8, which talks about patents and copyrights. It says, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing the limited times to authors and to inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So in other words, Congress is responsible for creating the patent office and copyright office that we have to hand out patents and copyrights to individuals that may come up with an invention or an idea. Clause 9 is very important because it says that Congress has the authority to set up all federal courts except for the Supreme Court. And Congress has the ability to decide what courts will hear what cases. So when we look at the federal court system, all of that was actually developed by legislation through Congress except for the Supreme Court. Clause number 10 talks about punishment for piracy. It defines what piracy is, and it lays out what the punishment could possibly be. Clause number 11 talks about the declaration of war. To declare war, grant letters of marque, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Only Congress has the ability to declare war. Although the President of the United States tends to get us involved in military actions outside the U.S., those military actions are usually referred to as conflicts. In order for a war to be labeled an actual war, Congress has to declare that it is a war. Gives you something to think about when we talk about the Korean War, when we talk about the Vietnam War, the Gulf War. Think about those. Okay, it also, Clause 12, grants Congress the ability to raise and to support an army. Congress has the power to create any army. The funds used to pay for it must be appropriated for no more than 2 years. So it gives you an idea that when Congress appropriates money for the military services, it at least appropriates that money for about a 2-year period. And Congress has the ability to create the army, not the president. Clause 13 talks about the establishment of the Navy and the Air Force. That's how Clause 13 helps to establish the Navy and Air Force. Clause 14, regulation of the armed forces. It says Congress sets the rules for the military mainly by way of Uniform Code of Military Justice, which was enacted by Congress in 1950. So all the rules that are associated with the military, the rules that they follow, were set by Congress. It goes on to say that in Clause 15, the militia, which today is known often as the National Guard, both Congress and the President have the authority to call the National Guard into federal service. So that means that if we have an armed conflict within the U.S. or outside the U.S., the President and Congress have the ability to nationalize individuals in the National Guard. Clause 16, how the militia is organized. When we look at this clause, pretty much it gives Congress the power to federalize the National Guard. Clause 17, creation of the District of Columbia. Pretty much that's what it is. It created the District of Columbia through an action by Congress to become the national capital. It did this in 1791. They took land, as you know, from the state of Virginia and Maryland. They granted the D.C. the district status. And the idea was not to actually have the capital of the U.S. or the federal government located in one particular state to prevent the idea of favoritism. Clause 18 talks about the Elastic Clause. This clause is often referred to as the Necessary and Proper Clause, and it grants specific powers to those, it grants specific powers. It grants no specific powers. What it does is that it grants the federal government the ability to adopt legislation as needed. So this is the clause that allows the federal government during times of war to require manufacturing industry to only produce manufacturing goods. This is the clause, the Elastic Clause, that allows for the rationing of food in World War I and World War II. All of this was done through the Elastic Clause. Now, Section 9 of Article 1 is important because it talks about the powers denied to Congress. It says, persons referred to slaves. Congress outlawed the slave trade in 1808. So Congress cannot enact a law that supports slavery. Can't do it. Habeas corpus. When we talk about the writ of habeas corpus, it is a court order that is directing a public officer who is detaining another person to produce the body of the detainee so the court can assist the legality of the detention. So in other words, you can't throw someone into jail and just leave them there. Because through a writ of habeas corpus, the court can require the police to produce that person and allow them to actually have a day in court or come before the court. So you just can't lock someone up, throw away the key, and never check on them again. Not possible. It talks about in Clause 3 of Section 9, special bills. It says no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. Now, a bill of attainder is a law that inflicts punishment without a trial. So that means that you could get arrested and thrown into jail and you never have a trial and be in jail for the next 15 years. Not possible. You can't do that according to the Constitution. The ex post facto law is that you cannot create a law today that bans something that was done yesterday and then go back and arrest those people today for what they did yesterday. Can't do that. Also, just a little bit more, Clause 4 talks about a direct tax. Congress cannot directly point out someone and tax them. An export tax is also talked about under Article 1, Section 9, and Congress cannot require Americans to pay a tax on goods to export those to another country. And then the rest of that continues to talk about other powers that are denied. And what you will discover is that there are a number of powers that are actually denied to Congress. Now we make it to Article 2, which talks about the executive branch. Basically, what I want you to remember here is that in Clause 1, it establishes the term of office for the president. And it pretty much states that the term of office will be 4 years. It also says the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. So it clearly states that all executive power of the president is the president. He doesn't share it with Congress. He doesn't share it with the Supreme Court. It also talks about the election process of the president, that the president will be elected by electors. It also talks about the time of elections. Believe it or not, the day that is set by Congress for elections is the Tuesday after the first Monday in November of every 4 years. So the president is elected every 4 years, and it's going to be the first Monday. It's going to be Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if the first day of November is a Tuesday, then the election will not be held until the following week, because that will be the first Monday. It also talks about qualifications for president. Again, it states that you have to be a natural-born citizen. It states the eligibility requirement in terms of age, at least 35 years of age, and a resident of the U.S. for at least 14 years. So again, and then it talks about the succession of the vice president. In case of the removal of the president from office for death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the state of the office, then those responsibilities become that of the vice president. Okay, powers of the president on Section 2 of Article 2. It clearly states that the president will be commander-in-chief of the armed forces in the U.S. So that means that we're talking about commander-in-chief over the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the United States Coast Guard. The buck stops with the president. The president will also have the treaty power, and the president also has appointment power. The president can appoint individuals to positions without the approval of the Senate, but he also has to have the approval of the Senate when appointing certain positions. Any treaties that are negotiated by a president must go through the Senate, so those treaties must be approved by the Senate. It talks about any vacancies that take place within the executive branch, that the president has the ability to actually go in and take care of those vacancies. Then it talks about Section 3, the duties of the president. And in Section 4 of Article 2, it talks about impeachment. This is something that I really want you to take time out and really read, because it will help you to understand the impeachment process. And it is a process. Impeachment does not mean that the president has been removed from office. Impeachment means that there have been articles of impeachment or charges filed against the president by Congress. And then the next step would be the trial in the Senate, which is what President Trump is experiencing now. And then they will determine guilt or innocence based on that. The next article is Article 3, that talks about the judicial branch. And pretty much under this article, it establishes the Supreme Court. It outlines the responsibilities of the Supreme Court, and then it gives Congress the ability to create all the courts that are below the Supreme Court. Article 4 talks about the treatment of citizens. Pretty much all states are required to respect another's laws, records, and lawful decisions. There are exceptions. A state does not have to enforce another state's criminal code. So if a criminal or someone flees to another state that has committed a crime in one state, then that state does not necessarily have to agree with the criminal code. But it does mean that another state must recognize the marriage of an individual and the divorce of an individual. And on treatment of citizens, it says a citizen of a state has the same right and privileges as the citizen of another state in which he or she happens to be. So that means that if I go to Missouri, then I should have all the same rights as anyone in Missouri, even though I'm an Arkansan while I'm there. It also talks about extradition, and pretty much it states that anyone accused of a crime in another state must be returned to the state in which the crime took place. But again, that's a sticky area. Okay, it also talks about how states are actually admitted into the Union. Pretty much it says no state may be created by taking territory from an existing state unless the state legislature consents to that, and that to pretty much be brought into the Union of the United States, it'd have to be approved by Congress. It also, under this, it promises a Republican form of government, meaning that we will elect representatives to represent the individual interests of the masses or the voters. Article 5 talks about the amendment process. How can an amendment be added to the Constitution? And there are actually two ways to propose an amendment. And there are actually two ways to actually ratify an amendment. And I'm not going to tell you that. I'm going to make you read it. When we talk about Article 6 to the Constitution, it talks about national supremacy. Pretty much what it does is that it declares that federal laws take precedent over all forms of state law and local law. So that means federal law supersedes state law if there is a conflict. Article 7 talks about the ratification process of the Constitution, meaning that at least 9 states had to ratify the Constitution in order for it to go into effect. Now, this is the thing, though. The 9 states ratified the Constitution without a problem, but the framers of the Constitution actually wanted all of the colonies to ratify the Constitution. Think about it. The reason they wanted all 13 colonies to ratify the Constitution really before going into effect was that they didn't want someone to come back later and say, oh, we didn't agree to this. How many times have you gone out with your friends or family, something happens, and then someone says, well, I didn't agree to this anyway, so it doesn't matter. You want everyone to have buy-in, because if you have everyone buying in, that means here in this terms, if you have all the states buying in, that means the citizens will buy in and they'll feel obligated. Going to the amendments, remember that the amendments were actually added to the Constitution after the Constitution was ratified. This was one of the first actions of Congress when Congress was established. So that means that the actual Constitution that was originally signed only consisted of those articles that we discussed. It did not consist of any amendments. So it's kind of interesting that it consisted of 7 articles and there were no amendments. The amendments came about as a result of an agreement pretty much between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The idea was to get them to agree to support the ratification of the Constitution on the promise that the amendments protecting certain basic and individual rights would be added. And that's where the first 10 amendments originated. The additional amendments to the Constitution have been added over time as society changes. When we look at those additional amendments beyond the 10th Amendment, what you will notice is that these amendments took place at different times. And they are examples of how times changed. The 19th Amendment grants women the right to vote. That's an indication that times changed, because originally women were not thought of in terms of being voters. Then the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, when you look at that, it talks about equal protection under the laws. It's saying, look, no matter what, no matter your past history, no matter whether you're black or white, male or female, or whatever, that you should be treated the same under the law because you are a citizen. So all citizens should be treated alike under the law, which gives you something else to think about. The establishment of an income tax is Amendment 16. So it establishes the fact that Congress can actually tax your wages. And remember, the idea behind the income tax is to allow Congress to actually have money to spend, and that's where their budget is coming from. If we take a look even closer at the additional amendments, what you will notice is that the amendments deal with voting or polling. It says, hey, you don't have to pay a poll tax in order to vote. A poll tax was designed actually to restrict blacks and to restrict poor whites from voting, because how many people wanted to pay $1 to actually vote? How many people today would actually pay money to be able to vote? Most people wouldn't. So, how many people would want to be paid by someone else to vote? That's a different story. So, as we look at the Constitution and we wrap up the review of the Constitution, what you will know is, what you will notice actually is that as society has changed, the Constitution reflects that change through amendments. At one point in time, slavery was accepted, and then later slavery was outlawed as part of an amendment to the Constitution. And you can see that the last amendment to the Constitution took place or was added in 1992. And before 1992, the amendment before the 27th Amendment, which is the 26th, was not added until 1971, which allows 18-year-olds to vote. So take a little time, review the Constitution, look at the powers of Congress, look at the powers that are denied to Congress, look at the constitutional requirements for membership to be in the Senate, to be a member of the House, look at what are the actual powers of the president. But remember, the Constitution is a framework. It was designed to say, hey, these are your powers, but as times change, the Constitution also can be made flexible. How is it flexible? It's flexible because we can add amendments to help make changes that reflect that time period. If you have any questions, please, by all means, send me a text message, send me an email. I'll be more than happy to talk more about the Constitution. Enjoy this.